Me and my girlfriend moved out to Montana a couple years back, because we're both big on spending time outdoors and never really enjoyed living in the city. We had agreed to go on a 2-day hiking trip just to get away from our jobs and spend some quality time together. Sarah found this trail online that should supposedly take us past stunning viewing points and would be pretty much on our own, since the route was labeled as challenging and required good fitness to master. We drove up early Saturday morning, packed with enough supplies for 2 days and 1 night of camping. The drive took us through increasingly remote terrain, with the paved roads eventually giving way to gravel and finally to a rough dirt track that tested the limits of my sedan. The trailhead parking area was nearly empty when we arrived, apart from 2 other pickup trucks. The first few hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. Sarah was in her element, constantly stopping to take photos, while I was just enjoying the moment. We made good time despite taking a few breaks. We set up our tent in a flat area near a small lake and gathered firewood as the sun began to set behind the surrounding peaks. Everything seemed perfect until we heard voices coming from the direction we had just hiked. Sarah and I exchanged glances, wondering who else might be out here so late in the day when most experienced hikers would have already established camp. The voices grew closer. Soon, 2 hikers emerged from the tree line where the trail entered our campsite. They were both middle-aged and looked like experienced outdoorsmen, with quality gear and the weathered appearance of people who spent a lot of time outdoors. They approached our campsite without any of the usual friendly greetings that hikers typically exchange. The taller of the 2 men, who had graying hair and intense blue eyes, spoke immediately, explaining that they had been following the trail and were looking for a place to set up camp. He asked if we minded sharing the area. We told him it was fine, although it was definitely strange, since there were surely many other good spots not too far off from where we were. As darkness fell, we started our campfire and began preparing dinner. The 2 men kept to themselves after setting up their camp on the opposite side of the clearing. We noticed they weren't cooking any food or engaging in normal camping activities. They just sat by their tent, occasionally talking in low voices that we couldn't quite make out. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah whispered that she was getting a strange feeling about our camping neighbors. I had been thinking the same thing but didn't want to worry her unnecessarily or seem paranoid about what might be perfectly innocent behavior. The men hadn't lit a fire despite the dropping temperature and weren't using headlamps even though full darkness had settled over the campsite. Whenever I looked over, they were looking straight back at me, as if they were watching our every step. We decided to turn in early, hoping they would do the same and that we'd get up early and leave. Inside our tent, Sarah admitted she was feeling increasingly uneasy about the situation, but I managed to calm her down, and eventually we both dozed off. Around midnight, we were both jolted awake by the sound of zippers being slowly operated. Through the thin nylon walls of our tent, we could hear movement outside, footsteps that seemed to be deliberately placed to avoid making noise on the rocky ground. Sarah grabbed my arm as we listened to someone walking around our tent. I unzipped our tent fly slightly and peered outside into the moonlit clearing. The 2 men were standing about 20 feet away, clearly visible in the pale light filtering through the forest canopy. They weren't moving, just standing there facing our tent like statues. One of them called out in a voice that carried clearly across the quiet campsite, claiming that they were having trouble with their tent and wondering if we had any extra stakes they could borrow. I told them we didn't have any extras and suggested they try to make do until morning when they could see better to diagnose the problem. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, and I hoped they couldn't detect the fear that was building in my chest. The men didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched out uncomfortably as they continued standing there for several more minutes before slowly walking back toward their tent. Sarah and I lay awake for the rest of the night, taking turns listening for any suspicious sounds and trying to convince ourselves that we were overreacting to what might be innocent behavior. We heard occasional movement and hushed conversations from the direction of their tent, but couldn't make out any specific words. As soon as the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the trees, we quickly packed up our gear. The 2 men were nowhere to be seen, and their tent appeared to be empty. We didn't wait around to find out where they had gone. We retraced our steps back to the main trail and hiked out as quickly as our legs could carry us, glancing over our shoulders frequently to make sure we weren't being followed. When we reached the parking area, the 2 other vehicles that were parked here the day before were gone. In their place was a different vehicle, a white van with tinted windows and no visible license plates. We didn't stick around to see who it belonged to or to investigate further. We loaded our gear into my car and drove straight home. Later that week, Sarah found a news article about 2 hikers who had gone missing in the same general area where we had been camping. The article mentioned that their abandoned car had been found at a trailhead about 10 miles from our location, and that search and rescue teams were still looking for any trace of the missing couple. The description of the missing hikers didn't match the men we had encountered, but the timing was unsettling and raised questions about what might be happening in that remote area. We never found out who those men were or what they were really doing out there in the middle of the night. But we both agreed that our instincts had been right, and that we had been lucky to trust the growing sense of unease that had kept us alert and ready to leave. Luckily, that was the only unsettling experience we ever had camping, and all our trips we've had in Montana since then have been great. I've always been someone who enjoys being on my own, which is why I started taking solo camping trips from a very early age. I'd been camping at the same location several times over the past year without ever coming across another person. The trail wasn't marked on most maps, and you had to know exactly where to turn off the main hiking path to find it. The plan was to head out on Friday morning and spend an extended weekend in the forest. I had brought extra books, my fishing gear, and enough food to avoid having to hike back to my truck until it was time to leave. I got to my spot sometime in the afternoon and set up my tent under a large oak tree that provided good shade and protection from any potential rain. Everything was exactly as I had left it on my previous visit, even the rock circle I had built for campfires. The familiar setting immediately put me at ease, and I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing my gear and collecting firewood. I woke up early the next day, made coffee, and spent a few hours fishing. After I realized that nothing was biting, I returned to camp after a few hours and lay down to take a nap in the shade. What must have been an hour utmost, I was awakened by the sound of someone walking through the forest. At first, I thought I might be dreaming, since I had never encountered anyone else at this remote location. But the footsteps were definitely real and growing closer. I sat up and listened carefully, trying to determine which direction they were coming from. A woman emerged from the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. She appeared to be in her 30s, with long brown hair and hiking clothes that looked relatively new. She was carrying a small day pack and was staring directly at me before approaching. She apologized for disturbing me and explained that she was just day hiking and had gotten turned around. She asked if I knew the way back to the main trail, which I was happy to help with. I gave her directions and offered her some water, which she politely declined. She thanked me and headed off in the direction I had indicated. I thought that was the end of it and went back to reading my book. But about 2 hours later, I heard footsteps again. To my surprise, it was the same woman. She seemed embarrassed and explained that she had gotten lost again. This time, she asked if she could rest at my campsite for a few minutes before trying to find her way out. I told her that was fine and offered to walk her back to the main trail, but she insisted she would be okay on her own. She sat on a fallen log about 20 feet from my tent and pulled out a water bottle, and we made up some basic small talk. She asked how often I camped at this location, whether I always came alone, and how many people knew about this particular spot. Her question struck me as slightly odd, but I answered honestly. I mentioned that I had been coming here forever, and that very few people seemed to know about it. After about 15 minutes, she stood up and said she was going to try to find the trail again. I offered once more to guide her out, but she declined and walked back into the forest. I watched her go and noticed that she seemed much more confident about her direction this time, which made me wonder if she had really been lost at all. The rest of Saturday passed without incident. I cooked dinner over my campfire and spent the evening reading and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. I went to sleep around 10 o'clock, feeling completely relaxed and safe in my familiar campsite. I woke up Sunday morning to find fresh footprints in the soft dirt just next to my tent. They were definitely from hiking boots, but there was no way they were mine. The prints were small enough to belong to the woman I had met the day before, but they could have been made by anyone with similar-sized feet. What was more disturbing was the fact that some of the footprints were only inches from my tent. Someone had been walking around my campsite while I was sleeping, getting close enough to touch the tent walls. I checked to see if anything was missing, but all my gear appeared to be undisturbed. I tried to convince myself that there was an innocent explanation. Maybe the woman had returned after dark and been looking for help, but didn't want to wake me. Or perhaps another hiker had been passing through and been curious about my setup. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I decided to pack up and leave earlier than planned. As I was loading my backpack, I found a small piece of paper stuck to my tent. It was a handwritten note that read, "Thanks for the information. See you next time." The handwriting appeared to be feminine, and the paper looked like it had been torn from a notebook. I hiked out as quickly as possible and drove straight home. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. I researched online to see if there had been any reports of problems in that area, but didn't find anything specific. I still can't make up my mind if I had been paranoid about the whole situation. Maybe the woman really was just in good spirits and was hoping that I was still up when she came back in the night. But her story about being lost and then coming back to my tent 3 times made absolutely no sense. I haven't been back to that campsite since, and I'm not sure I ever will. The whole experience has messed up that spot for me, and I don't think I would ever be as relaxed as I once were. Whatever that woman was planning, I'm glad I trusted my instincts and left when I did. The note she left behind made it clear that she intended to return, and I'm glad I didn't stick around to see what she had planned. I've always been drawn to the quieter parts of the wilderness, places where you can go days without seeing another soul. That's exactly what I was looking for when I decided to spend a long weekend at Birch Creek State Forest, about 3 hours north of where I live. It was early September, still warm during the day, but with that crisp edge to the air that promised fall was coming. I'd picked a spot about 2 miles in from the nearest parking area, far enough to discourage casual hikers but not so remote that I'd be completely cut off if something went wrong. The campsite sat in a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by thick forest on 3 sides. I spent the first day getting settled and exploring the immediate area. The woods were beautiful but had an oddly quiet quality to them. Even during the day, I noticed how few birds I heard, and the usual forest sounds seemed muted somehow. On the second morning, I decided to follow one of the trails that led deeper into the woods. About a mile from my camp, I came across something that made me pause. There was a hunting blind set up in the trees, maybe 15 feet off the ground. It looked relatively new, constructed from fresh lumber and camouflage netting. What struck me as odd was the timing. Hunting season was still weeks away, and most hunters I know don't set up their blinds until much closer to opening day. I stood there for a few minutes, studying the structure. It had a clear view of a small meadow where deer would likely come to feed. The craftsmanship was impressive, clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing. But something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way it seemed to loom over the trail, or how the shadows underneath it created dark pockets that I couldn't quite see into. That evening, as I sat by my campfire, the rational part of my mind said it was probably just another outdoorsman, maybe someone who'd been out scouting for the upcoming season. But there was something about the whole setup that didn't sit right with me. The blind was positioned in a way that gave it a commanding view, not just of the meadow, but of the trail I'd been hiking. Anyone sitting up there would have seen me coming and going. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and focus on enjoying my time in the woods. The fire was crackling nicely, and the night was clear enough that I could see stars through the canopy. But every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward the direction of the trail, half expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness. The next morning, I decided to take a different route for my hike, one that would loop around the area without passing the hunting blind. But as I was breaking camp and getting ready to leave the next day, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to take one more look at that blind, maybe see if there were any other signs of recent activity. When I reached the spot, I immediately noticed something different. There was a small pile of cigarette butts at the base of the tree that hadn't been there before. They were fresh, some still showing traces of moisture from the morning dew. Someone had been here, probably sometime during the night or early morning. I looked up at the blind, and that's when I saw him. A man was sitting in the structure, perfectly still, watching me. He was maybe 40 feet away, close enough that I could make out his face clearly. He had on camouflage clothing and a hunting cap, but what struck me most was his expression. He wasn't surprised to see me, wasn't trying to hide or call out a greeting. He was just watching, with the kind of focused attention that made my skin crawl. For a long moment we stared at each other. I raised my hand in what I hoped was a friendly wave, but he didn't respond. Didn't move at all, actually. Just kept watching me with those steady, unblinking eyes. I called out and said hi, but the man didn't respond. He just kept staring at me. After a moment, I decided to continue on my way. But as I walked, I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my movement along the trail. The sensation was so strong that I turned around twice to look back, and both times he was still there, still watching. I tried to convince myself that it was just an awkward encounter with an antisocial hunter, but something about the whole situation just felt weirdly off. When I got back to my campsite, I started packing up my gear earlier than I'd planned. The encounter had left me feeling unsettled, and I figured it was better to head home a day early than to spend another night in the woods feeling paranoid. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard voices coming from the direction of the trail. Male voices, at least 2 of them, speaking in low tones that I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to be getting closer. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The voices had stopped, but I could hear footsteps now, multiple sets, moving through the underbrush. They weren't following the trail. They were moving through the forest itself, and they seemed to be heading straight for my campsite. That's when I realized that the man in the hunting blind had probably been watching me for longer than just that morning. He'd seen me set up camp, knew where I was staying, and had likely been observing my movements for the past couple of days. The thought made my blood run cold. I quickly stuffed the rest of my gear into my backpack and shouldered it. The footsteps were getting closer now, and I could hear branches breaking as whoever was out there pushed through the thick underbrush. I had maybe a minute before they reached the clearing. Instead of heading for the main trail, which would take me right past the hunting blind, I decided to go the opposite direction. I knew there was a creek that ran along the back of the campsite, and I figured if I followed it downstream, it would eventually lead me to one of the other trails that connected to the parking area. I slipped into the trees just as the first figure emerged from the forest on the far side of the clearing. Even in the brief glimpse I got, I could see it was the same man from the hunting blind. He was carrying something in his hands, something that looked like rope. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could through the woods, following the creek downstream. Behind me, I could hear voices again, louder now, as they discovered my abandoned campsite. One of them called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was something false about the tone, like he was going through the motions of seeming friendly while knowing perfectly well that I was nearby. I kept moving, using the sound of the creek to mask my footsteps. The terrain was rough, full of fallen logs and thick underbrush that caught onto my clothes and backpack. After a good hour of rushing through the bush, I finally reached a trail that I recognized. It was one of the lesser-used paths, but I knew it would take me back to the parking area where my car was waiting. I didn't slow down until I reached my vehicle, and even then I kept glancing back at the trailhead as I loaded my gear. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't feel truly safe until I was back on the main road, miles away from the forest. I never reported the incident to the authorities. Looking back, I'm not sure what I would have told them. A man sitting in a hunting blind wasn't illegal, and I had no proof that he and his companions had intended to do me harm. But I know what I felt in those woods, and I know what I saw in that man's eyes.